I've been trying to write this down for 4 months. Not because I don't remember it. That's the problem, actually. I remember all of it. I remember it the way you remember something that happened to your body, and not just your mind. The way you remember a car accident, or a fever that went on too long. It's lodged somewhere below the part of me that chooses what to think about. It just surfaces. 2 in the morning, or in the middle of a conversation with someone normal about something normal. It surfaces, and I have to wait for it to pass. I'm writing it down now, because I think if I don't, I'm going to spend the rest of my life with it stuck in my chest, and that seems worse than whatever happens after I tell it. So, here it is. My name is Reese. I'm 31 years old. I worked the night desk at a motel called the Pineridge Motor Lodge for 11 months. And I'm going to tell you everything that happened there. Not the highlights, not the jumps, all of it. Because the thing about this particular story is that the scary parts only make sense inside the ordinary parts. Pull one out without the other, and it's just a weird thing that happened. Together, it's something else. Something I still don't have a word for. The Pine Ridge is about 40 minutes south of Astoria, on a stretch of Highway 101 that the coast hasn't quite figured out what to do with yet. The ocean is close enough that you can smell it from the parking lot on certain nights, that cold, iron smell, but you can't see it from the motel. There's a tree line in the way, Douglas firs, old ones, that block the view and hold on to the dark even on bright days. The motel itself is one story, U-shaped. 12 rooms arranged around a central parking area. The office is at the front, in the crook of the U. There's a vending machine that works, and an ice machine that mostly does. There's a pine tree in the center of the lot that is genuinely enormous, old enough that the roots have started pushing up the asphalt around it in long, slow buckles. In the summer, it smells good. In the winter, it's just dark and very large. The rooms are numbered 1 through 12. Simple enough, but the numbering skips 9. There's 8, and then there's 10, and the space where 9 would be is a storage room. Linens, cleaning supplies, the fuse box. Always has been, the owner told me, which I'll get to. I took the job in October, the year before last. I'd been in Oregon for about 6 weeks at that point. Coming from a situation in California I'd rather not detail, except to say it involved a lease I couldn't get out of, and a person I'd trusted more than I should have. And when those two things stopped being separate problems and became one problem, I'd driven north with about $300 in a duffel bag and the vague sense that the Pacific Coast was somewhere you could start over, because the country ran out of road, and you had no choice. I found the listing on a job board in a coffee shop in Seaside. Night desk attendant, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 5 nights a week. Position includes housing in the on-site manager unit. Pay was not impressive, but the housing was the thing. I called the number. The owner's name was Dennis Farrow. He was in his mid-60s, and he ran the Pine Ridge with a precision that surprised me at first, and then, later, made a specific kind of sense. He met me at the motel on a Tuesday afternoon. He walked me through the office, the rooms, the storage room, the grounds. He was a compact, economical man who chose his words carefully and never seemed to be saying more than he intended. He'd owned the Pine Ridge for 19 years. He'd bought it from the family of the original builder, who had put it up in 1962 and run it himself until he couldn't anymore. He showed me the office last. It was small, a front desk, a computer that handled reservations and credit card processing, a door to a back room with a cot and a mini fridge for the night shift. The desk had a landline. It had a keyboard, 12 hooks, 12 keys. It had a rack of local tourist pamphlets. And it had, in the center of the desk on a shallow wooden stand, a ledger. It was the old kind. the kind you don't see in practical use anymore. Hardback cover, cream pages, columns pre-printed in green ink. The columns read, date, room, name, arrival, departure, payment, notes. I said, "Is this in addition to the computer system?" He said, "The computer handles billing. The ledger is separate." I asked what the ledger was for. He said, "Logging guests. Some guests prefer not to appear in the digital system. They pay cash. They stay off the books in the official sense, but they still get logged. The ledger is for that." I said, "Is that legal?" He said, "It's a motel in Oregon. It's legal enough." He paused. "The ledger is important. I need you to understand that. Not the computer. The computer handles itself. The ledger requires attention." I said, "In what way?" He said, "You'll see." And then, with the kind of straightforwardness that I was starting to understand, was simply how he operated. I'm going to be honest with you, because it would be worse for both of us if I wasn't. The ledger behaves in a way that takes some getting used to. I'm not going to explain it to you right now, because explaining it before you've seen it won't help. What I'm going to tell you is this: don't panic. Don't ignore it. Write down exactly what you see every time, and call me if you're unsure. I said, "What's the number?" He wrote it on a sticky note and put it inside the ledger's front cover. He said, "I'll be in the residence unit next door until November, when my wife and I go south for the winter. After that, it's just you." He left. I started that night. For the first 3 weeks, nothing happened. And I want to give you those 3 weeks, because they matter. The night shift at the Pineridge was quiet in a way that had texture to it. Oregon coast. Quiet is different from other kinds of quiet. There's always something moving. The trees, the wind off the water, the sound of the highway in the distance, light and rhythmic, like breathing. The motel sat in a pocket of its own atmosphere. Inside the office, the sounds were small, the refrigerator hum, the occasional creak of the building settling, the vending machine's ambient electrical drone. I checked in guests when they arrived late, which was not often. I watched television on a small set in the back room. I made instant coffee at 1 in the morning because that was when the tiredness arrived reliably. A heavy softness behind the eyes that you have to push against. I logged every cash guest in the ledger. Those first 3 weeks there were only 5. A couple who paid in 20s and didn't want to use their credit card, which I understood without asking. A man traveling alone who requested the room farthest from the highway, which was 12. An older woman who arrived in a car so packed with belongings that it looked like she was moving her whole life down the coast, which maybe she was. Logging them was simple. Date, room, name. They gave me their names, always. That was one of Dennis's rules. Arrival time, departure time left blank until morning. Cash payment noted. Notes column empty. The ledger was a perfectly ordinary object for 3 weeks. Then October became November, and Dennis and his wife drove south, and I was alone. The first time the ledger filled itself in, it was a Thursday. I know it was Thursday because I'd watched most of a documentary about migratory birds earlier in the evening and had the irrelevant thought that I could never remember which night had which television program. And then I'd checked my phone, and it was a Thursday, and I'd thought, right, Thursday. It was 12:40 in the morning. I know the time because I'd just refreshed my coffee and looked at the clock on the wall above the keyboard. 12:40. I set the coffee down. I turned back to the desk. The ledger was open to the current page. It was always open. Dennis had been specific about that. You kept it open. You didn't close it between uses. There was a new entry. I had not written it. I want to be precise about what I mean. I had been at the desk all evening. I had logged one cash guest at 9:15. A man named Carl Ebert, room 4, paid $60. Driving through on his way to Tillamook. One entry. And then nothing, because no one else had come in, and I had been at the desk or in the back room no more than 15 feet away for the entire shift. And yet there was a second entry on the page, below Carl Ebert's, in the same column alignment, in handwriting that was, "I'll come back to the handwriting. I'll come back to it." The entry read, "Date. The night's date, correct? Room 7. Name. Helen Marsh. Arrival. 11:52 p.m. departure. Blank. Payment. Left blank. Notes. Transit. Been before." I looked at it for a long time. Then I looked at the keyboard. Room 7's key was on its hook. I went to the window. The parking lot was visible from the office, lit by 2 amber lamps on poles. There were 3 cars in the lot. Carl Ebert's truck, my own car, and a car I didn't recognize. A dark blue sedan, slightly older, parked outside room 7. Room 7's light was on. The curtains were drawn, but there was light at the edges, the kind of warm bar of light under a motel room door that means someone is inside with the lamp on. I went back to the desk. I sat down. I looked at the entry. Transit. Been before. I picked up the phone and called Dennis. He answered on the second ring. It was nearly 1 in the morning, and he answered like a man who had been awake and waiting. I said, "There's an entry in the ledger. I didn't write it." A pause. He said, "What room?" I said, 7, and there's a car in the lot outside 7, and the light is on. He said, "Is the name Helen Marsh?" I said, "Yes." He said, "All right." A pause. "Leave the key on the hook. Don't knock. She has her own way in." I said, "Dennis?" He said, "I know. I'll explain when I can. Right now, I want you to do 2 things. Write your initials next to the entry. Just your initials. RM, if that's right. Just so it's noted you witnessed it. And then look at the notes column and tell me exactly what it says." I read it to him. He made a sound. Not surprise. Something closer to confirmation. He said, "Helen Marsh has been coming to the Pineridge since 1987. She comes when she needs somewhere to stop. She doesn't come to the office. She doesn't take a key. She pays. You'll find it in the morning. Always room 7, always cash, left on the ledge above the baseboard heater. She'll be gone by 6. I said, "How does she get in?" He said, "I don't know. I've never asked. I will tell you this. In 19 years, room 7 has never been damaged, never been left in a condition that required anything more than a standard turnover. She leaves it cleaner than most guests, actually." I said, "The entry. I didn't write it." He said, "No." I said, "Who did?" He said, "It writes itself. Or, she writes it, somehow, from the room. I don't know the mechanism. I know it happens." I said, "That's not possible." He said, "I know." He paused. "Reese, I'm going to ask you to sit with this tonight. Just observe it. You're safe. I need you to know that, because it's true. Nothing that has ever come from that ledger has caused harm to anyone working that desk. I would not have given you this job if I thought otherwise." There was something in how he said it that made me believe him. Not because he was a persuasive man, because he was such an unpersuasive one. He said things flatly, and let them sit. And this sat like something he'd verified many times. I said, "Okay." He said, "Call me in the morning." I stayed at the desk all night. I read the entry many more times than was useful. I looked out the window at regular intervals. The light in room 7 stayed on until 5:40, and then it went off. At 6:15, I went out. The car was gone. The room was unlocked. The door swung open with a push. It smelled like cedar and something faintly salt chemical, like the ocean on a low-tide day. The bed had been slept in and the sheets pulled back up, not made properly, but smoothed. The towels were hung, not dropped. The trash bin had one item in it, a bus schedule for a route I didn't recognize, folded in half. On the ledge above the baseboard heater, held down by nothing, a $60 bill and a 10. I took the money. I wrote payment, $70 in the ledger. Then I stood for a moment looking at the notes Dennis had given me on the inside cover, his phone number, and below it, in his handwriting, a list of names. 7 names, with room numbers next to each. I recognized Helen Marsh immediately. She was the first on the list. Dennis came back up in late November. I'd been there 7 weeks by then. And we sat in the office on a Tuesday afternoon when the motel was empty, and he told me everything he knew, which was not as much as I needed, and more than I'd expected. He'd bought the Pineridge in the early 2000s from the daughter of the man who'd built it, a man named Goss, who had run the place from 1962 until he was too old to, who had then passed it to his daughter Carol, who had run it for another decade before selling it to Dennis. Carol had been the one to show Dennis the ledger on his first day of ownership. She'd shown him the list on the inside cover and said, "These are the ones that find their way in. You'll know them by the ledger telling you." Dennis had not believed her. Not for the first 8 months. And then Helen Marsh had appeared in room 7, logged in the ledger at 12 minutes before midnight, and he'd understood that Carol Goss had been telling him the exact truth. He'd called Carol. She'd told him what she knew, which was what her father had told her. Harold Goss had noticed it in 1969, 7 years after opening. The first self-written entry. A man named Pete Vollmer, room 3, one night in March. Harold had been terrified. He'd called the police. The police had found room 3 exactly as Dennis would later describe room 7. Undisturbed, clean, settled. No sign of forced entry. No sign of anything really, except that a person had been there and rested and left. Harold had been a practical man. He'd sat with it. Over the years, he'd identified the pattern. The names were consistent. When they came in the same room. They came irregularly, sometimes months apart, sometimes years. They paid. They left the rooms better than they found them. In 30 years of running the Pineridge, Harold Goss had never had a guest complaint about any of them because no regular guest had ever encountered any of them. They arrived after midnight. They were gone before the first checkout. Harold had never spoken to any of them directly. He'd tried once, knocking on room 3 when Pete Vollmer was in there. No answer. No sound from inside. And yet, in the morning, the bed had been slept in, and the money was on the heater ledge. Dennis said, "I tried twice, same thing. They're present, but not in a way that responds to knocking." I said, "But the ledger?" He said, "The ledger is the point of contact. That's the only place they... Communicate is too strong a word. Register. Make themselves known." I said, "There are 7 names on the list." He said, 7 that I've identified. There may be others I haven't. The ledger occasionally writes entries for names that aren't on the list, and I don't know if they're new or if they're ones I missed." I said, "How often does it happen?" He said, 2 or 3 times a month, sometimes more in winter. I think the highway traffic in winter brings more of them through. I sat with that. More of them, as if they were something with a population, as if they moved through the coast like weather. He said, "Can you continue?" I said, "I need to understand what I'm looking at, what they are." He said, "I don't know." I said, "Guess." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Harold Goss thought they were people who had died on the highway. This stretch of 101 has a history, long history. Head-on collisions, cars off the shoulder, the fog that comes in off the water in December. It's taken a lot of people. Harold thought they were those people, still in transit, still moving through, the way they were when it happened. And the motel is somewhere they can stop. He paused. He said, I don't know if he's right, but in 19 years I've noticed that the ledger entries correlate. Sometimes, with old accident reports. The names match. Not always, but enough times that it's not coincidence. I said, Helen Marsh. He said, 1987, November. She went off the road 8 miles north, in the fog. She'd been driving from Portland. The car was found, but she wasn't. For 3 days. The searches concluded she must have gone into the water. He said it matter-of-factly, the way you report something that happened a long time ago to a stranger. I said, but she's still coming here. He said, every few months, has been since before I owned this place. I said, and the money. He said, the money is real. I've spent it. It's real money. He gave me the list, which I already had, and he told me to add names as I encountered new ones. He told me to call him if anything changed in the pattern. If an entry appeared for a room other than the ones on the list, if a departure time filled in for a guest who should still be there, if anything about the handwriting changed. I said, the handwriting. He said, what about it? I said, the first entry, Helen Marsh. The handwriting was. It looked like old handwriting, not a style I recognized, but it also looked like. I stopped. It looked a little like mine. He looked at me. He said, describe that. I said, like mine but older, like if I'd been writing the same way for 40 years. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I want you to note that. In your own separate notes, not the ledger. A notebook, something you keep for yourself. I want you to date it and describe what you observed, and I want you to keep noting it if it continues. I said, has it happened to other people who worked this desk? He said, the person before you noticed it after about 3 months. She kept notes. She gave them to me when she left, which I'll share with you. I said, why did she leave? He said, she found the work too isolated. It wasn't the ledger. She just got lonely. He said it straightforwardly, without drama. The ledger wasn't the problem for her. The coast in winter was the problem. He left the next morning for the south again. I went back to the desk. I started a notebook. The second time I encountered a new entry, I was ready for it. Sort of. It was mid-November, 2 weeks after my conversation with Dennis. 3:15 in the morning. I'd been reading and I looked up for no reason in particular. The instinct you develop when you work alone in a quiet building. The animal part of you that monitors the ambient sound and flags a change. And I looked at the ledger. New entry. Room 2. Name. Thomas Cully. Arrival. 3:11 a.m. Departure. Blank. Payment. Blank. Notes. 2 nights this time. Thomas Cully was not on Dennis's list. I looked out the window. A truck in the lot outside room 2. Old model, dark color, something loaded in the back under a tarp. I added Thomas Cully to the list with a question mark. I wrote the date and the entry in my notebook verbatim. Then I looked at the note that said 2 nights this time, and thought about what this time implied. Not 2 nights. 2 nights this time. Like a comparison. Like he'd been before and stayed 1 night. I searched through the ledger for Thomas Cully, which took a while because there were years of entries and it wasn't indexed. I found him eventually, 3 pages back, a 1.5 years earlier, before I'd started, in Dennis's handwriting, but with the same logged-from-nowhere quality. Date. Room 2. Name Thomas Cully. Arrival 2:48 a.m. Notes, just the one. The ledger had its own memory. It was building a record, not just of arrivals, but of patterns. Been before. Just the one. 2 nights this time. A kind of ongoing notation, accumulating across years. The truck was gone the second morning. The room had been used for 2 nights. Both beds slept in, which was odd, but both made back up after a fashion. $3 bills on the heater ledge and 2 quarters. I wrote the payment in and looked at the entry. In the departure column, which I had not touched, someone had written, "Left before dawn, 2nd day." I called Dennis. He said, "The departure filling in is normal. Sometimes they do it themselves. Sometimes it happens on its own. I think the ledger just resolves it. Doesn't always happen, but when it does, let it stand." I said, "He stayed 2 nights, and there were 2 beds slept in." Dennis was quiet for a moment. He said, "What does the entry say?" "The notes." I said, 2 nights this time." He said, "Did the entry for his previous stay say anything?" I said, "Just the one." He was quiet again, longer this time. Then he said, "Note it. I'm noting it on my end, too." He didn't offer an interpretation. I didn't push. I was learning by then that Dennis Farrow operated in a permanent state of careful uncertainty, and that this was, perhaps, the correct state for someone managing what he was managing. You didn't jump to explanations. You just kept the record. I want to tell you about room 9, or the room that would be 9 if it existed. I mentioned it at the beginning. The storage room between 8 and 10. Linens, supplies, fuse box. When Dennis showed it to me on my first day, he said, "Storage. Keep it locked. The key is on the board." The key was there, a yellow tag that said, "Storage." For the first 2 months, I had no reason to go in except once for extra towels. I unlocked it, grabbed what I needed, locked it again. Shelves, the smell of bleach, the fuse box in the back. Nothing odd. In December, a ledger entry appeared for room 9. Date: a Wednesday, just into December. Room 9. Name: June. Arrival: 1:07 a.m. Departure: blank. Payment: blank. Notes: she has been waiting. Just the one name: June. No last name. I sat there for a long time. I looked at the keyboard. The key for storage was on its hook. I looked out the window. The parking lot outside the wall shared by rooms 8 and 10. The wall that had no door in it because there was no room. 9 was empty. No car. I went out anyway. I walked to the exterior of the building, slowly, in the cold. The wall between 8 and 10 was blank. No window, no door. Solid painted cinder block. But the wall was warm. I don't mean slightly warm. I mean warm the way a wall is warm when there's been a lamp on inside for hours. When I put my palm flat against it, in the cold night air, it was warm enough that I held my hand there because it felt good, which is a ridiculous thing to admit, but it's true. In 40-degree weather in the dark, that wall felt like a window with sun coming through it. I went back inside and sat at the desk. She has been waiting. Not she waited. Not she came. Present continuous. She has been waiting. Ongoing. A state that had begun before that night. I called Dennis, and I knew before he picked up that this was a different conversation. He picked up, and I said, "Room 9. He said, "Tell me." I described the entry. I described the wall. I read him the note verbatim. He was quiet for a longer time than usual. When he spoke again, his voice was careful in a way that was different from his usual carefulness. He said, "June is not on my list." I said, "She didn't have a last name in the entry." He said, "I know who she might be." A pause. Harold Goss had a daughter named June. She died in 1959, before the motel was built. She was 7 years old. There was a car accident on the highway. She and her mother. He paused. Her mother survived. Harold built the motel 3 years later. I said, Room 9 doesn't exist. He said, no. I said, but the wall is warm. He said, I know it is. It's been warm since I bought the property. I thought it was a heat pipe running through the wall. I had a plumber look at it in my second year. There's no pipe. I said, she's been waiting inside a room that isn't there. He didn't answer that directly. He said, note everything. The temperature, the entry, the time. Note it all. I said, Dennis, she has been waiting. Waiting for what? He said, I don't know. Maybe for Harold. A pause. He's been gone a long time. I went out again at 4 a.m. and put my hand on the wall again. Still warm. Still that comfortable, stable warmth, like something that had been lit from inside for a very long time. The entry for June was still in the ledger in the morning, but the departure column had filled in, and the time it gave was 1:07 a.m., the same as the arrival time. She had arrived and left in the same moment. Or maybe the ledger was saying she had never quite arrived at all. The wall was still warm, though. It was warm every night I worked there after that. I stopped being unsettled by it and started thinking of it as a kind of presence, the way you might think of a sound you've integrated into your normal environment. It was just there. Warm in the cold, lit by something. I should tell you about the handwriting, because I kept noting it, and the notes tell a story of their own. First observation, November. The handwriting in the self-written entries looks like mine, but older. Like mine after 40 years of the same habit. Second observation, late November. I noticed today that my handwriting in the regular entries, the ones I write myself, has shifted slightly. Not dramatically, but the loop in my lowercase d is different from how it was in October. More open, less closed. Third observation, December. Looked back at the October entries I wrote myself. My D was closed back then. Now it's open. The self-written entries also have an open D. I don't know when it changed, or whether I changed it, or whether the book is changing it. Fourth observation, January. Dennis sent me the notes from the previous night attendant. Her name was Priya. She worked here for 8 months. Her observations about the handwriting start in month 3. She notes the same thing. A gradual convergence. Her writing and the ledger's writing becoming similar. She says by month 5 she couldn't tell them apart without looking at context. She left in month 8. She doesn't explain why she left. Dennis was right that she said it was the isolation. But the last entry in her notes says this. I caught myself writing an entry I didn't remember starting. I looked up and the entry was half in my handwriting and half in the ledger's. I don't know where one stopped and the other began. I read that and set Priya's notes down and looked at the ledger for a while. Then I looked at the most recent self-written entry. Helen Marsh from 2 weeks earlier. And I looked at my own logged entries from the same period, and I spent about 20 minutes comparing them carefully. And I couldn't tell the difference. I called Dennis. He picked up, and before I could say anything he said, "You found Priya's notes?" I said, "Yes." He said, "How are you feeling about it?" I said, "Honestly, I don't know. I don't know if it means something is happening to me, or if it just means I've been writing in the same book with the same pen and the same columns for 3 months, and that produces convergence. That's a normal thing. Styles bleed into each other." He said, "Yes." I said, "But." He said, "Yes." I said, "But Priya's last note." He said, "Priya's last note." I said, "Has that ever happened to anyone else? Writing something without starting it." He said, "You're asking if the ledger has ever used a living person to write an entry." I said, "Yes." He was quiet. Then he said, "Once. Not since I've owned the place. Harold Goss mentioned it to Carol. It happened in the late 70s. A night attendant named Ray. He would come to and find entries finished that he'd apparently been writing. He didn't remember writing them. He wasn't in any distress. He just didn't remember. I said, "What happened to Ray?" He said, "He worked there for 4 years. Moved away eventually. Harold sent Carol a Christmas card from him a few times in the 80s, from an address in Montana." I said, "So he was fine." He said, "By all accounts." I said, "I'm going to keep working." He said, "All right." A pause. "Reese, I want you to start dating your notebook entries with the time, not just the date. And I want you to note every time you look at the ledger and feel certain about whether you're looking at your handwriting or not." I said, "You want me to track the drift." He said, "I want to understand the system." By February, I had what I thought was a partial understanding of the system. The ledger was a record, not just of the guests who came, but of all of them, going back to whenever the ledger's memory began. And its memory seemed to go back further than its physical pages should have allowed. I'd turned to the first page many times. The oldest entry was from 1964, 2 years after the motel opened. But some of the entries I'd found tucked inside the later pages, written between other entries, fitted in impossible spaces, the way words sometimes appear in the margins of a book you're sure you've read before. Those entries had dates that didn't add up. 1958, 1961, before the motel existed. The ledger was not just tracking guests, it was tracking something that had been there before the building. The highway, maybe. The land. The particular fold of Oregon coast where 101 runs close to the water, and the fog comes in heavy, and the trees hold the dark, and cars have been going off the road since there were cars. The guests, the ones who came in through the ledger, were people in transit, as Dennis and Harold Goss had understood. People who had been on this road and then weren't anymore, in the way that most of us aren't prepared to think about clearly. And the motel was a stop, a place that existed in whatever layer of the world they now occupied, in parallel with the ordinary motel, where ordinary guests paid with credit cards and complained about the Wi-Fi. That was my working model. I was aware it was incomplete. The irregularity I hadn't been able to account for was June. She didn't fit the transit model. She was a child who had died in 1959 on a road she hadn't been traveling alone, in a car driven by her mother. She wasn't a lone driver who went off the shoulder. She was 7 years old, and this was her father's land. She wasn't in transit. She was home. Or something like it. Or waiting for something that felt like it. And the wall? I thought about the wall a lot. About the warmth of it in the cold. About a room that had never been built. That existed in the ledger, but not in the structure. Harold Goss had built this motel in 1962, 3 years after his daughter died, and when he numbered the rooms, he had left a space. Not accidentally. Deliberately. Room 9 was not a mistake in the numbering. It was a room he'd planned, and then not built, or built differently, built as a wall, built as a space that was held. The storage room's key hung on the board with all the others. Storage, yellow tag. One night in February, I took it down and unlocked the storage room, and stood in the doorway looking at the shelves and the fuse box. And then I moved the shelves of towels to one side, the cheap freestanding wire rack sliding on the linoleum, and I put my hand on the back wall. The inside of the storage room was cold, normal cold. The back wall was cold, but the right-hand wall, the wall shared with whatever space was notionally room 9, was warm. I pressed both palms flat against it and stood there in the dark in a storage room at 2 a.m, and I said out loud, feeling slightly foolish, "Hi, June." Nothing. No sound. No response. Just the warmth against my palms. But it didn't change when I said it. It didn't get warmer or colder or flicker or do anything. It was just warm, steadily, the way a thing is warm that has been warm for a very long time. I went back to the desk. In my notebook I wrote, "I think she's been there since before the building. I think Harold built the wall knowing she was there and left the space for her and didn't mark it as anything useful, because making it useful would have changed what it was. It's not a room. It's a held space, an acknowledged space." Then I wrote, "I don't think she's waiting for Harold anymore. I think she's just been waiting so long it's become what she is. I don't know if that's sad or if it's just a different way of being somewhere." In March, the ledger wrote an entry that changed things. I was at the desk at 11:40 at night, early in the shift. I hadn't been away from the desk. I'd been reading and drinking coffee, and I looked down at the ledger, and there was a new entry. Date: that night. Room: 7. Name: Helen Marsh. Arrival: not yet. Departure: blank. Payment: blank. Notes: different this time. She's asking. I looked at the clock. 11:40. I looked at the parking lot. No blue sedan. The entry was already there, but the time said not yet. The ledger had written a future entry. I called Dennis. He picked up, and I could tell from his voice that he'd been asleep. I said, "I'm sorry, I need to tell you this now." I described the entry. I read the notes column aloud. He was quiet. Then he said, "Different how?" "Different from what?" I said, "I don't know, it doesn't specify." He said, "And she's asking." "What is she asking?" I said, "The entry doesn't say." He said, "Has anything like this happened before? A future entry?" I said, "Not that I know of. I'll check." I searched through all of the self-written entries I'd cataloged in my notebook. No future entries. No entries with "not yet" in the arrival column. This was new. Helen Marsh arrived at 12:58 in the morning, the blue sedan quiet in the lot, the room 7 light on by the time I noticed the car. I'd been watching. I didn't see her go in. One moment the lot was empty. The next the car was there and the light was on. In the ledger, the arrival column had updated itself. The "not yet" was gone. In its place, 12:58 a.m. I sat at the desk for a very long time. At 3 in the morning I did something I had not done before and have not done since. I went to room 7 and I knocked. Nothing, as Dennis had described. No sound from inside, just the bar of light under the door. I said, "Mrs. Marsh." I said it to the door at 3 in the morning on the Oregon coast, with the trees dark behind the lot and the smell of the ocean somewhere in the air. I said, "The ledger says you're asking something. I want to help if I can." Silence. Then, after a long moment, I heard something. Not a voice, a sound, very faint, from inside the room, the kind of sound you might dismiss if you weren't actively listening. Like paper moving, like a pen on a surface. I waited. Then silence again. And after a few minutes I went back to the desk. In the ledger, in the notes column of Helen Marsh's entry, there was new text. Written below the original note in the same ambiguous handwriting. It said, "Tell the owner his daughter sends her love." I read it 4 times. Then I thought about Dennis, his daughter. I barely knew anything about Dennis's personal life. He was a private man, and I hadn't pushed. But I thought about the way he'd bought this motel 19 years ago. The way he'd devoted himself to understanding it without fully understanding it. The way he'd left for winter every year for 19 years and come back every spring. The way he answered the phone at 1 in the morning. I thought about whether the word owner meant Dennis or Harold Goss, who had died decades ago. I thought about whether those were even separate questions, in the layer of things that the ledger tracked. Then I thought, Helen Marsh has been coming to room 7 since 1987, since before Dennis. The owner she knew first was Harold. Harold had a daughter named June. Harold's daughter sends her love. From inside a room that doesn't exist, through a warm wall, relayed through a woman who has been traveling a stretch of highway in the fog for 36 years. I sat with that until morning. In the morning, the money was on the heater ledge, $60 and a 10, the same as always. In the morning, I called Dennis, and I read him the note, word for word. He was quiet for a very long time. When he spoke, his voice had something in it I hadn't heard before. He said, "I'll be up there this week." He drove up from Southern Oregon in 2 days. We sat in the office together, both of us looking at the ledger, and he read the entry for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "Harold built this place for her. You understand that?" I said, "I think so." He said, "Not as a memorial, as a continuation. He knew she was here. He didn't know how to say it to anyone, so he just built around it, numbered rooms and left a space." I said, "She's still warm?" He looked up. I said, "The wall. The right-hand wall in the storage room. She's still there. I checked last night." He said, "I never went in the storage room and put my hand on that wall. 20 years. I never did that." I said, "I know." He put his hands on the desk on either side of the ledger. He looked like a man who had been carrying something for a very long time and had just set it down to look at it in better light. He said, "She's all right then?" It wasn't a question. I said, "She's warm." He nodded, and that was all. That was the entire thing between us about it, and it was enough. Summer came. The motel filled up more in summer. The ordinary guests, the families and hikers, and people driving the coast for the long views and the fish and chips and the way Oregon looks in July, when the gray lifts and the water goes green. The nights were shorter, and the ledger was quieter in summer, which Dennis had told me was consistent. He thought the long light kept them moving, the ones who came through the ledger. He thought the dark brought them in. I had 17 entries through the summer I could attribute to the ledger, the self-written kind. Most of them were names from the list, familiar ones. Helen Marsh came twice. Thomas Cully came through in June and stayed the one night again. No truck this time. No second bed slept in. One entry in August was new, a name I hadn't seen before, and no car in the lot. And the room 11, was a room that had never appeared in the ledger before. I checked. Nothing irregular about room 11 in my stay. Clean room, standard. I'd put guests in it 20 times. But that August morning, when I checked room 11 after the self-written entry, the room was undisturbed, except for one thing: the notepad that sat on the bedside table. The Pineridge notepad with the pine tree logo had writing on the top sheet. 3 words. "Thank you. Moving." I brought the sheet to the desk and put it inside the ledger between the current pages. It felt right. It felt like it belonged in the record. Then I sat down and thought about what moving meant. Not moving on, not better. Just moving. In the sense of being in motion. Like they'd stopped for the night and now they were continuing, the way the ordinary guests continued down the highway toward Portland or Astoria or wherever they were going. I thought, that's what this is, a rest stop for people who are still going somewhere, just on a road we can't see. I didn't know if that was comforting or not. It was something, though. It was something concrete to hold. I need to tell you about September, because September is where the story changes again. I'd been at the Pineridge for 11 months by September. The handwriting convergence was complete by that point. I'd noted it in my book in August, the date when I looked at the ledger and genuinely could not identify a single entry as definitively mine or definitively the other. They'd become the same hand. I was comfortable with this by then. I'd watched it happen gradually enough that each step was small, and the sum of the steps hadn't alarmed me the way it might have if I'd arrived in month 11 and seen month 1 and month 11 side by side. But in September, something happened that wasn't gradual. It was a Friday, 2 in the morning. The lot was empty. No guests in the motel at all. I'd had a quiet week. I was reading Steinbeck, East of Eden, the long one, and I was comfortable and slightly drowsy in the way of 2 a.m. in a warm room when nothing is happening. I looked up. The ledger had a new entry. I leaned forward to read it, and I felt, before I read it, a kind of pre-recognition, a warmth in my stomach that was either familiarity or dread, and I couldn't separate them. Room 7. Name: Reese Moreland. Arrival: 2:04 a.m. Departure. Blank. Payment. Blank. Notes: he's been here before. He'll come back. My name. My name. In the ledger. In room 7. With an arrival time 2 minutes ago. My room was the manager unit, not a guest room. And I was here. I was at the desk. I was present and awake and unambiguously here, sitting in the chair at the desk with a book in my lap. I put the book down. I looked at the keyboard. Room 7's key was on its hook. I looked out the window. The lot was empty. No blue sedan. No truck. No car. Nothing. I looked at the entry again. He's been here before. He'll come back. Been here before. Not he arrived. Not first visit. Been here before. Like it was noting something about my relationship to this place that predated the entry. He'll come back. Future tense. A notation about the future. The ledger had never made a future notation about a person who was currently alive and present at the desk. Not in Priya's notes. Not in anything Dennis had told me. Not in any of the historical record Harold had passed to Carol and Carol to Dennis. I called Dennis. It was 2 in the morning. He answered on the first ring. I read him the entry. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, "Your full name." I said, "Reese Moreland." He said, "Spelled correctly in the entry." I said, "Yes." He said, "Are you all right?" I said, "I'm here. I'm at the desk. I'm fine." He said, "Reese, I want you to look at the entry for Helen Marsh from last March, the one that said different this time." I turned back through the pages. I found it. He said, "Read me the arrival time." I read it. Not yet. And then, below it, the corrected time when she'd arrived. He said, "The ledger wrote your entry the way it wrote hers, before you did whatever you're going to do." I said, "What am I going to do?" He said, "I don't know, but the ledger apparently does." I sat with the open ledger and the phone against my ear for a moment. Then I said, "It says I've been here before." He said, "You've worked here 11 months. I said, "That's not what it means." He said, "No." I said, "What does it mean?" He said, very carefully, "I don't know, but I want to tell you something. The ones in the ledger, the ones who come through, they're not all from car accidents. That was Harold's theory, and it held for a lot of them, but not all. Some of the names I've checked, and I can't find an accident or a death attached to them at all. I've always thought maybe some of them are just people who were here so completely, so entirely present in a place, that some part of them stays, the way a fire marks a hearth." I said, "You think I've marked this place?" He said, "I think 11 months of sitting alone with something like this, paying attention to it, taking it seriously, I think that's a kind of presence that leaves something. I said, and that he'll come back. He said, I'm not sure that means what it might sound like. I said, it sounds like it's telling me I'm going to die and come back here. He said, or it's telling you that you'll return someday, in the ordinary way, that you'll be drawn back to this place because you paid attention to it, and it paid attention to you. A long pause. He said, or both. I don't know. The ledger doesn't explain itself. I sat with that. The room was very quiet. Outside, the highway breathed. The trees held the dark. I said, Dennis, did you ever have an entry written for you? He was quiet for longer than usual. Then he said, yes. Year 7. It was in my room 1, where I stayed when I was in residence. And the notes column said 2 words. A pause. It said, keeps watch. I said, and you stayed? He said, I stayed. I said, I'm going to keep working tonight. He said, I know. I said, I'll call you in the morning. He said, I'll be up. I handed in my notice in October, almost exactly 11 months after I'd started. Not because of the entry, or not only because of it. I'd been thinking about it for a while. About what came next. About the thing I'd been avoiding by staying in one quiet place for close to a year. I was 31. I had rebuilt something in those 11 months. Some structural thing in myself that the California situation had knocked loose. I was ready to go somewhere. Dennis took it as he took everything, practically. He said he'd advertise the position. He said he'd send me Priya's forwarding address if I wanted to reach out to someone who'd understand what the job had been. He said the manager unit would be mine through the end of the month. On my last night, I sat at the desk, and I looked at the ledger for a long time. My entry was still there. Room 7. Name Reese Moreland. Arrival 2:04 a.m. departure. Blank. The departure column was still blank. I picked up the pen. I'd been writing with it for 11 months. The same pen. The one that lived in the desk drawer. The one Dennis had shown me on the first day, and whose provenance I'd never determined. I held it for a moment. Then I put it back. The departure time wasn't mine to fill in. I understood that by now. The ledger wrote what it wrote, on its own schedule, according to a logic I had 11 months of evidence for, and no theory sufficient to explain. I'd learned when to let the system do its work. At 5 in the morning, I went out to the lot. Cold, October, the smell of iron and pine. I walked to the wall between rooms 8 and 10 and put my palm against it. Still warm. The same steady warmth it had always been. I stood there for a minute, my hand against the wall, in the dark, in the cold. I said, I'm going now. The warmth didn't change. Steady, constant, the way something warm is when it has been warm for 60 years and intends to go on. I went back inside, and I got my bag, and I drove out of the Pineridge Motor Lodge as the sky went from black to the specific dark blue that comes before any visible light, and I watched the motel get small in the rear view and then disappear behind the tree line. That was 14 months ago. I'm in Portland now. I have a real apartment, a roommate, a job that uses more of me than a night desk does. I've called Dennis 3 times since I left. He tells me the ledger is fine. The motel is fine. He found a new night attendant. A young man named Joel, who Dennis says is cautious but curious, which Dennis thinks is the right combination. I haven't driven down the coast. I've been close to it, twice on trips south, and both times I've felt the pull of it somewhere below rational thought. The specific gravity of a place you've been entirely present in, a pull that is physical, almost, like leaning into a current. I've kept my notebook. I still add to it occasionally, even though I'm not there anymore. Observations about memory, about presence, about what it means to pay sustained attention to something invisible and be changed by it. I don't know what the notebook is for now. It might just be for me. I think about June, about the warm wall and what it holds, and whether Harold Goss, wherever he is, has found his way to wherever she is, and whether those are even separate geographies, or whether the whole architecture of here and elsewhere is more porous than I can currently model. I think about Helen Marsh in her dark blue sedan, still moving down 101 in the fog, stopping at room 7 when the night gets long. I think about Thomas Cully and his truck, and his tarp-covered load and his second bed, and what he's carrying and where he's been, and whether the second night means he's resting or waiting, or whether the distinction matters in his case. I think about my entry, the departure column still blank, the note that said, "He'll come back." I'm not sure I believe in a cosmology that requires me to die before I return there. I think Dennis was right that it might mean something simpler. I think the ledger knows things about the relationship between people and places that we don't have a vocabulary for yet, and it expresses them in the language it has, which is arrival and departure, which is the language of a motel. Maybe it just means, this place knows me. This place has my name. And whenever I come back, for whatever reason, in whatever condition, the room will be ready. I try to find that comforting. Most nights, I do. I looked something up last week. I've been avoiding it for 14 months, but last week I looked it up. The original building permit for the Pineridge Motor Lodge, Harold Goss, 1962. I found it in an archived county records database, scanned and grainy. The plans were drawn up for a 13-room motel, 1 through 13. But then, Harold had amended the plans. There was a second document, filed 3 weeks after the original. In the amendment, the room count was reduced to 12. The room between 8 and 10 was redesignated as storage. But in the margin of the amendment, in Harold Goss's handwriting, I found a photograph of his handwriting from a Historical Society article about the railway years, and I compared it in Harold Goss's handwriting, very small, a note to the county clerk, or to himself, or to no one in particular. It said, "No 9 is taken. Leave it for June." I've looked at that 12 times since I found it. The photograph of those words, in faded ink, on a document from 1962. I keep thinking about the night I sat at the desk with my palm flat against the warm wall and said her name out loud for the first time, and how the warmth didn't change. But how, for just a moment, I had the absolute and unverifiable and utterly certain feeling that something in that warmth settled, the way a room settles when someone inside it hears a familiar voice through the wall and understands they have not been forgotten. I can't prove that. I know I can't prove it. But I was there, and I was paying attention, and I kept the record, and that's what I have. That's everything I have. I went back last weekend. I didn't plan it. I was driving south for something unrelated, and the exit for 101 was right there, and I was in the lane, and then I wasn't fighting the pull anymore. The pine ridge looks the same. The pine tree in the lot has pushed the asphalt up another fraction. The letters on the sign all match now. Dennis finally replaced the old S. I didn't go into the office. Joel was on the day shift, and I didn't want to explain myself to someone who didn't know me. I just walked the lot once, slowly, in the afternoon light. Rooms 1 through 12, the U-shaped path around the parking area, the old vending machine still running. I stopped at the wall between 8 and 10. I put my hand on it. Still warm. I stood there for a while. Then I drove back to Portland, and I sat down, and I started writing this. I finished it an hour ago. I closed my notebook, I made tea. I went about my evening like a person who has simply been somewhere and come back, which is what I am. And then, just now, sitting here with the tea going cold, reading back through the last thing I wrote, I opened the notebook again to add a date to the final entry. And I stopped, because on the page opposite the last thing I wrote, the blank page I always leave opposite, the page I look at when I'm thinking, the white space I've been looking at all evening while I wrote on that page, in blue ink, in handwriting I recognize completely. There is a single line. It says, "Departure. Pending." The ink looks wet. I haven't touched that page.